trees as part
Sorry,
of
that
the
was me.
intervention. That's all right. That's okay. Um, and so hopefully today, what I'll do is I'll try and cover some of what Triade does and maybe give you an idea about how you could integrate trees into some of your work. Yeah, so if we get into it, if you write questions in the chat or maybe do them at the end, I think if I try and get through the presentation in the next 25-30 minutes, then we should have time for questions. So just a quick little bit about Triade. Triade was set up by foresters in 1987, and they set Triade up with a view to using trees to try and address environmental and social issues that they saw going on. We currently work in 6 countries across Africa, so from Senegal in the west to Ethiopia. And our modus operandi is really to work in rural areas with smallholder farmers. We're working in an area where climate impacts are quite high, and the margins in terms of subsistence and people's resources is quite low. So we see trees as a means to kind of address some of those problems and some of those challenges. As an organization, Triade has grown quite a lot in the time that I've been here. I think the interest in trees as a nature-based solution to a lot of the kind of different challenges that we're seeing has grown. And so has the ability for Triade to mobilize funding. So we were, I think, spending probably less than 2 million a year on our projects when I started, and it's more like 10 and a half, 11 now. So maybe a 5 times growth in 10 years or so. So there's funding available for people to do this kind of work. And it's important. Where we work also aligns roughly with, I don't know whether you've ever heard of the Great Green Wall Initiative. It's an African-led initiative that's looking to try and restore land all the way across the continent in a mosaic kind of fashion, where you've got work going on by different partners and different actors. Governments are signed up to this, and it's a useful kind of rallying point, a useful policy position for us as Triade, but also to work with other people, because we need as many people doing this kind of work as possible in order to halt degradation and then try and restore land that's being degraded over time. At Triade, we split our approaches into 4 key areas, and we'll try and touch on some of these throughout the discussion. But they're so big, and there's a lot to say about all of them, so we won't be able to touch on all of them with great detail. But if you see something that's of interest, then we can always talk about it at the end. So we have the ecosystem conservation and restoration itself. It's kind of an investment in natural capital, and that really looks at how we grow the trees and who's planting them and how we can restore land. I guess it's more like the technical process of restoring the landscape and protecting that landscape through better management and ecosystem restoration. In order to do that, we see secure governance, rights, and local control of resources as a key underlying feature. So people won't invest their time, they won't invest for the long term in an area unless they have recognized access rights to that area. They won't protect the land in the same way if they don't get any benefit from that land. And therefore, we see that as a key factor in a successful restoration or protection project. We see market systems development as another key function. So if you think of the degradation of the land and the negative impacts of losing that land as more like a stick, then the market systems development is more like the carrot. If we can develop markets and value chains that use trees and tree products, then that gives people the incentive to use trees and to protect trees in the longer term. And if communities benefit from the trees, then we've seen a much greater engagement and motivation in the landscape restoration work that we're doing and protecting forests that exist already. The other way that we try and use trees is integrating them into food systems and for the purpose of food security. Obviously, trees grow fruits and nuts, so they themselves can provide additional foodstuffs, and the leaves. And we also integrate them into farming systems whereby they have other ecological benefits. You have nitrogen fixing trees, which help restore soil fertility. There's shade, there's other benefits from those. So they're the four main approaches that we've got, and we'll touch on them as we go, as I said. Wait a second while you have a chance to read the moving slide, because it's all a bit exciting, that bit. So we've been planting trees since 1987, and TreeAid has developed a more holistic approach since the early days when tree planting was kind of, let's plant as many trees as we can. Now we have a much more mature, holistic way of doing that, touching on those 4 points above. We try to do holistic projects that touch on all of those kind of things to give the project the best chance of succeeding. And just in the last strategy period, since 2022, we have grown just over 21 million trees. We've seen a huge increase in the number of trees that we're planting. But it's the impact that I'm more interested in, and hopefully that you would be interested in as well. So we're able to see reduction in households living in poverty, and we've seen that drop by 52% during the time that we've been implementing projects over the last 5 years. And that's come from an increase in income. And you can see that we've managed to increase income from the non-timber forest products. That's something that we mention a lot in our work. It's value chains that aren't based on the timber from the trees, but based on other products coming from the trees. So we can increase communities' income derived from those through our work by up to 800%, which is an amazing kind of change, and especially in the context that we're working in, that can make a big difference to people in terms of their diversified incomes. I'm going to try and simplify our approach in terms of planting into 2 or 3 kind of ways. And I've defined them as communal planting and agroforestry. So communal planting is planting on shared land. So it could be within existing forests, and we would count that as enrichment planting, trying to make those forest areas more diverse and more rich, and kind of restoring degraded areas within the forests, or taking areas that used to be forest a long time ago and restoring them because they're no longer used for farming. Maybe they've become degraded, and that will have a wider ecosystem benefit. And when we're doing that, we're usually working with the wider community. It will involve more people being engaged. I think the forest governance part here, the access and the land rights, is kind of critical. Making sure that you've got the right people involved to do that. So it's a bit more complex because there's more people involved, but obviously you can restore a wider area in a quicker time and plant more trees in these areas than you could in a farming system. Within here, we're also looking at what livelihood opportunities there might be for communities that are planting for the long term and the short term. Agroforestry, if you've never heard of it before, is essentially planting trees on farm systems, so on farmland in an integrated way. That can be kind of planting trees to support crop growth, but it can also be planting trees on farmland to support agro-silvopastoral systems, which is essentially crops, trees, and animals. So you could grow trees that provide food for animals, or you could, like I said, grow trees in an integrated way with crops. Again, here, there's an ecological benefit. There's soil fertility, there's shade, there's water retention. So we expect that we see increases in crop yields and better farm performance. which then negates the fact that people might want to expand their farm to get more production. So we try and make more of the land that's already being farmed this way. But there's also direct economic benefits from the trees, because they're normally going to be fruit trees and other kind of producing trees that people can use. And here we're working typically with individual farmers or families working on their farmland. Out of the two planting approaches, more of our planting is in communal spaces and forest spaces, as opposed to agroforestry, but we do both. One thing I also wanted to mention here, especially for people that maybe jumping straight to growing trees and planting trees might be more difficult, is another process which is assisted natural regeneration. So this is it's an alternative to planting. It's a bit cheaper and it can be really effective. And I guess there's two ways of doing this. If you have an area that's degraded, but it's degraded because it's often grazed by animals or it's burned by farmers, if you protect that area, over time there will be a natural regeneration. So you're taking out the impacts of the humans and the animals, and nature will do the job better in terms of restoration. The other kind of practice that we can talk about here is a seminar. So this is the cutting of trees or shrubs in a way that allows the tree to grow to maturity, which is what we can see in this video. You can cut other branches away, and then that tree will have better chance of growing and increase the biomass and the vegetation in that area. So that can be considered as well. And obviously, if that's of any interest to people, then we can talk about that. Oops. So hopefully that gives you a kind of overview as to what TREADE does and some of the ideas. And what I wanted to do as well was to try and give you some food for thought about practical considerations of adopting tree planting into any of your projects. So, I mean, getting hold of the trees in the first place, you can obviously buy or grow the seedlings yourself. So often in areas that you're working, there may be government or private nurseries that already exist. So you could purchase the seedlings and support communities to plant them out in whichever way you've chosen. But by embedding kind of nurseries into local communities and giving them a space and the training to grow their own nurseries, you can provide a job and a business opportunity beyond the end of the project, and communities could continue growing and planting their own trees in a sustainable way beyond the end. So it's definitely worth considering, and we've set up hundreds and hundreds of nurseries across our projects. But some things to consider if you do decide to go down that route is where you would site a nursery. Is it going to be close to the planting sites? And has it got access to water? Is it protected? Typically, you would want them to be protected by some fencing. Who's going to be available to do the work? I mean, if it's existing groups that have already got a site that's kind of fenced off, then that makes it easier, but they might need support in training. It's good to set up contracts or agreements that make it clear to the groups that you're engaging with as to how you're going to help them grow the seedlings and how to buy, and maybe fix a price for buying the seedlings at that point and when they're going to get paid. And like I said, you can develop nurseries as enterprises, and you can support those nurseries to have a business plan and a clear idea about how many trees they would grow and how they would sell them to what kind of other projects or groups. And as I'm sure you know, country to country, project to project, it's hard to say exactly how much these things cost every time. But to give you an idea, you could have a simple nursery at a community level for maybe £2,000, depending on what exists there to begin with. And if you were looking at developing maybe an enterprise project nursery, then maybe you'd be looking to invest more. So investing in a kind of a higher end business level nursery, you may be looking at investing in solar panels and boreholes and things like that. I've got a little bit of echo from some, I'm not sure where, but let's carry on. So if you've got an idea to do some tree planting, how do you decide what trees and where you're going to plant them? So there definitely has to be consultation. There should be a community-led process. We don't engage in going into communities and saying, we're going to plant 10,000 of this species here, and you can either accept it or not. It's much more of a consultation. What kind of species are available and what do people want? So again, some considerations about what you might want to kind of to think about when you're going to do your planting is the ecological side of it. What kind of trees are suitable? What's already there will give you an idea. If you talk to communities, they might tell you about trees that used to be in the area but no longer are there anymore for whatever reason. What pressure has been there before. But you may also want to think about, in a degraded space, what kind of species would be best to plant first, maybe with a view to then planting other species later. There's also a question about, would you plant exotic species? At TreeAid, we don't. We tend to use indigenous species because they're better adapted to the environment. Introducing foreign species has its own risks. But you may find that there's particular species that communities want, like eucalyptus is often desired by farmers because they can cut it and pollard it and use the trunks for construction and things like that. It can be more economically valuable as a timber product, but it's quite water heavy and it has other impacts on the environment. So, and it's an exotic species. So sometimes you may find that you have to compromise with people. And then in terms of livelihoods, the other side of the benefits of the trees, what kind of products are used locally? Like, do people eat shea in the local communities? Like, does shea exist in the first place in there? And if you're going to encourage a market-based kind of planting or using existing trees in the area and you want to support that process, how are people going to access the markets that exist? Finally, at TreeAid recently, we've engaged much more in carbon projects than we ever have before, and that is a livelihood option because there's benefits economically from the trees and the carbon sequestered by those trees, which can provide an income for 20, 30 years for people. So again, that's a consideration in terms of a livelihood option. When you're planting, there will be constraints about what you can plant and when, and that is something that we consider on an annual basis when we're making our planting plans. If you've decided what kind of species you want, when are those seeds going to be available, or where can you get them from? Communities can sometimes go and collect those seeds locally, and they tend to be well adapted to the environment because they're growing in the area already. But you can also purchase seeds from, again, sometimes governments have stocks of seeds or other research institutions. And then you need to work backwards from when you can plant, because when is the rainy season? I mean, in the areas that we work, we have the rainy season starts in kind of July and lasts maybe till September, but climate change is making that more difficult to predict. But you need to start there and work backwards as to what species will take longest to grow, and then at what point do you start that process in the nurseries. And the availability of labour in the nurseries, or at the time of planting, you need to think about that, because sometimes planting season aligns with the farming season. So it's not always going to be simple to engage communities during certain times. And then if your rainy season is short, then you want to plant ideally towards the beginning of that to give the trees the best chance of surviving the following dry season. It's all going to be context specific, but these are the kind of things that are critical when you're planning a planting project. Community engagement, we have found, is absolutely fundamental to any tree planting activity. And that covers your planning, your growing, the preparation of the land, and then once the trees are planted, how are they going to be protected thereafter? And this is where we spend quite a lot of our time understanding who needs to be involved in that process. If it's communal land, you may have people that live locally, but you may also have people, pastoral groups that maybe come through, or other groups that actually come through and use the land at different times of year. So you need to think about engaging those people too. Going back to that forest governance and that land rights kind of approach, we need to make sure that people have got recognised land use and land rights kind of access to the areas that you might want to plant or the existing forests. And we develop forest management plans in those instances, which help outline how communities and management groups that we help mobilize will manage the area. So can they do any cutting? Are there periods where they won't graze on that land? And it's all of those kind of considerations. As I just said, we mobilize communities into groups in order to try and make it easier to prepare the land, to do the planting, and then to engage with the monitoring and the following up of those planting areas. You need community engagement to identify where you might want to do agroforestry sites, and you want to identify the people that will help the project succeed in terms of influencing communities to bear in mind what's happening on the project, like what's being planted, and protecting those trees will be critical. Because it's a waste of money if we plant the trees and then they all die, which can happen because there's lots of risks. So just some of the risks that we regularly kind of experience are fires. So people will often start fires for numerous reasons, which can impact planting sites. We also have flooding potentially at times, grazing from animals and pastoral communities, cutting in clearance, so people coming along and removing trees because they want to start a farm. And then we have pests, believe it or not, we have termites, we have monkeys digging up baobab roots from time to time, and we have rats that kind of eat some of the tree roots as well. So these are all considerations that you'd have to think about when you're planting. What are going to be the challenges thereafter? One way that we found to really improve survival rates is to prepare the land in advance. So digging pits before the trees are planted helps aerate the soil, it helps collect water and other organic matter before the tree planting happens. And then when you plant the trees, they've got the best chance of surviving. Typically, we're using traditional techniques for doing this. So these are things that maybe with a small investment into equipment, local communities can pick up really easily, and it will really support the survival rate of those trees. This is a picture from Ethiopia where we've set up these surveillance brigades on a project that's been really successful actually in terms of survival. And we've equipped these guys, they get paid a small amount of money. Not every project will be able to do that because of the budget, but where possible, if you can engage communities to come out and protect trees, then that makes a big difference, because they can spot fires, they can peacefully kind of move people on if they've come to cut or to graze their animals in planting sites, and they can call communities to come and support in any issues that kind of come up. So they get phones, they get the coats, they get the umbrellas. It's just an example. We don't do this on every project, but it has really worked on this project. And when I was last in Ethiopia, I was talking to someone who was a member of those groups, and we've seen a survival rate of more than 90% on this project. And it was just really interesting to hear from Mohammed about what it was about our project compared to previous projects that made it successful. And I think the points that I was just talking about are underlined by what he said, and kind of borne out in the survival rates that we've seen on that project, which has been brilliant. Again, trying to go back to that holistic approach, survival rates of trees that you're planting will also be linked to the perceived benefits that people can get from trees in the long term. So really, if you're able to, within projects, develop enterprise work or livelihoods components to it, then that's like the carrot. People will make those links between, I can get an income from these trees as well as the other environmental benefits that exist, which may be less tangible immediately for people. And you can use existing trees to support that process. You don't have to wait to plant trees and then wait for 10 years until they're growing. You can explore the existing tree kind of resource, and you can develop enterprises at the same time as doing the tree planting restoration work. You can do grafting of trees, which will produce quicker, but generally we try and use existing trees and products to try and motivate and incentivize wider tree related kind of activities. And that could be non-timber forest products enterprises, the agroforestry we've discussed. And at TreeAid, we've also got this nutrition garden approach, where within a nursery setting, we grow typically baobab and moringa trees, which can be harvested for their leaves, like just after a few months. So it's a much quicker realization of a livelihood benefit or a nutrition benefit. So these trees are grown in the gardens. People are harvesting the leaves. They can process them to sell, or they can use them at home. And then after a few years, we take those trees and we plant them out. So it acts like a nursery, but while the trees are growing, they're being harvested for their leaves. So that's a very quick kind of, like I said, the realization comes quickly. So it's quite helpful in that process. Again, with tree survival, if you're planting trees in agroforestry spaces, the survival tends to be easier to keep high because people are attending their farms more regularly, so it's easier for them to tend the trees that are planted there. But if you can find really productive trees, if you can graft them, they can return a benefit quickly. Here you've got some cashew apples. So the cashew nut actually grows at the bottom of the apple, but we were developing value chains around the apples themselves as well, because people weren't using the apples on this project in Ghana. So we were making apple jam and cashew apple kebabs, which the women were selling. And it really kind of invigorated the value chain around the cashew orchards that were there and on the new cashew farms that we were planting. And developing business plans for groups, for individuals, to really give them that forward thinking vision as to how they will use the trees in the longer term. Again, really supports in the investment of the tree planting and the process. Some other cross-cutting benefits, there's a huge number of other benefits, but I'm just highlighting a few here. At TreeAid that we've noticed that we are able to really tap into is gender empowerment. A lot of the tree products that we work with are actually typically collected and processed by women. So in West Africa especially, the shea and the baobab and the mangoes and things like that we grow, it's typically women that do the collection of the nuts or whichever product and processing those. So it actually helps with the income and women actually having access to income, but it also helps in terms of social cohesion and standing, both in the household and in the communities. We've seen huge benefits from targeting women for some of these activities. Youth in sub-Saharan Africa, there's a huge youthful population that are without jobs or without access to resources. So using communal resources such as the tree products in local forests. We can support youths. And unfortunately, where we're working, we've got lots of internally displaced people for insecurity reasons, and we're able to support some of those communities through things like nutrition gardens, where we're giving internally displaced people access to land to quickly find a new activity and a new livelihoods kind of opportunity. So these are ways that trees and these kind of systems can be used to address other cross-cutting issues. And finally, I just wanted to, I mean, if you decide to do any of this and you're interested in doing it, how do you know whether you're doing it well? With the monitoring and evaluation, some of the things that you might be looking to measure might be the tree survival, and there's numerous ways to do that. Typically, you're going to go and find an area and count the number of trees that are still there. Ecological changes, especially over longer term, you might be looking at vegetation cover, whether or not you've had a biodiversity impact. That could be both the trees themselves, but it could also be animals that may return to areas that have been restored. You may also want to look at the destructive practices that you've maybe had an influence on. So, as I said, nature will do a lot of the work if destructive practices are removed from an area. So if you can reduce fire or cutting, then areas will recover and restore themselves. On the livelihood side, you might be looking at diversification and increases in income, food sources. So maybe people have got more access to, for example, the leaves during the dry season. In the countries that we work in, often during the dry season, there's not much dietary diversity, and having access to nutrition gardens will allow people to get access to leafy greens. So that's a great benefit for local households. But you may also want to look at some of those social impacts, like access to forest resources and access to land and gender empowerment. So it's quite a lot. There's a broad range of things that you could measure depending on which project kind of approach you've adopted, or what the focus and the objective of the project is. That's just some ideas around that. That, I think, is the end of what I wanted to say by way of trying to introduce it, but we have time now for any questions.